The Great Hall of the Galactic Coalition stretched for miles in every direction. Thousands of species sat in their assigned seats, their strange bodies shifting and moving as they listened to the speaker at the center. Ambassador Vethral of the Corvani stood tall on his 6 legs, his silver scales catching the light as he spoke to the gathered representatives. "We have watched the humans for 50 of their years," he said, his voice calm and certain. "We have studied their broadcasts, their literature, their history, and we have reached a conclusion that I believe will interest this council greatly." He pressed a button on his device, and images appeared in the air above him. The images showed human cities with tall buildings made of stone. But these buildings were not homes or places of work. They were memorials, walls covered with names, flames that never went out, statues of soldiers with sad faces looking down at the ground. "The humans call these monuments," Vethral explained. "They build them to remember their wars. Every major city on their planet has dozens of them. They teach their children about the horrors of battle from a young age. They hold ceremonies where their veterans, their former warriors, weep openly in front of crowds." A murmur went through the crowd. Weeping warriors. The idea seemed strange to most species present. "Their leaders speak constantly of peace," Vethral continued. "They sign treaties, promising never to fight again. They create organizations dedicated to preventing conflict. Their popular entertainment is filled with stories about the terrible cost of war." He paused and looked around the great hall. "My conclusion is simple. Humanity is a species that dreads war. They fear it deeply. They are, at their core, a fragile and fearful people who would rather surrender than fight." In the back of the hall, the Dravok delegation leaned forward with interest. The Dravok were a proud warrior species. They had conquered dozens of worlds and enslaved billions of beings. Their empire was built on strength and the willingness to use it. Commander Zethkar of the Dravok military whispered to his superior, "Earth is rich in resources. Their oceans contain minerals we need. Their population would make excellent workers." The Dravok High General nodded slowly. "If they are as weak as the Corvani says, this could be easy." 2 weeks later, the Dravok hegemony announced its intention to claim Earth as a colony world. The Galactic Coalition offered no objection. After all, the humans were clearly unable to defend themselves. It would be a mercy, really. The Dravok would bring order to their chaotic little planet. The message was sent to the human diplomatic vessel Horizon, which floated peacefully near the edge of the solar system. Captain Sam Harris was eating his dinner when his communications officer called him to the bridge. Sam was a man in his middle 50s. His hair had turned gray years ago, and lines covered his face like a map of all the difficult decisions he had made in his life. He had spent 30 years in space, first as a pilot, then as a captain. He had seen things that would break most people. But he had also seen beauty and wonder, and the best of what humanity could be. He read the message on the screen 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. "They want us to surrender Earth," he said quietly. "They are giving us 30 days. Lieutenant Kate Morrison stood beside him. She was younger than Sam, maybe 35, with short brown hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been his first officer for 5 years, and he trusted her completely. "What do we do, Captain?" she asked. Sam stared at the message for a long moment. The Dravok fleet was large. Their weapons were powerful. They had conquered species far more advanced than humanity. By any logical measure, they should win. But Sam knew something the Dravok did not. He knew what humans were capable of when they were pushed. He had read the history books. He had seen the old photographs. He had listened to his grandfather's stories about wars fought long before anyone dreamed of traveling to the stars. "Send word home," he said finally. His voice was heavy with something that sounded like grief. "Tell them we tried diplomacy. Tell them it failed." Kate nodded and turned to the communications console. Before she could begin typing, Sam spoke again. "And Kate? Tell them I'm sorry." She looked at him with confusion. "Sorry for what, sir?" Sam closed his eyes. "For what comes next." The message traveled at faster than light speed, reaching Earth in a matter of hours. It was received by a junior officer at a listening station in Australia. She read it, checked it twice, and then called her supervisor. Her supervisor called his superior. Within an hour, the message had reached the leaders of every nation on Earth. The Dravok intercepted the transmission. Of course, they monitored all human communications, but they did not understand what they were hearing. The humans were not organizing a defense. They were not calling for weapons or soldiers. Instead, they were sending messages to their families. They were telling their children they loved them. They were visiting churches and temples and mosques. Commander Zethkar laughed when he heard the reports. "They are praying to their gods," he said. "They know they cannot win. They are already accepting defeat." He ordered his fleet to prepare for the journey to Earth. 300 warships, each one capable of destroying a city. It would be the easiest conquest in Dravok history. But Zethkar had made a mistake. The same mistake that Ambassador Vethral had made. The same mistake that the entire Galactic Coalition had made. They saw humans weeping and thought it meant weakness. They saw memorials and thought it meant fear. They saw a species that spoke constantly about the horrors of war and concluded that humanity would do anything to avoid it. They did not understand that humans spoke about the horrors of war because they knew those horrors personally. They did not understand that the memorials were not monuments to defeat, but promises. Promises to remember what was lost. Promises to honor those who fell. Promises to never let such sacrifices be in vain. And most importantly, they did not understand why humans truly dreaded war. It was not because they might lose. It was because they knew what happened when they decided to win. In homes across Earth, grandparents looked at old photographs hidden in drawers. Parents held their children a little tighter. Veterans who had spent decades trying to forget began to remember. Something was waking up. Something old and terrible and patient. Something that humanity had worked very hard to keep sleeping. The Dravok had no idea what they had done, but they would learn. The emergency session of the United Nations was broadcast to every screen on Earth, in coffee shops and living rooms, in hospitals and schools, in prisons and palaces. People stopped what they were doing and watched. The chamber was filled with world leaders, their faces serious and pale. But there was no panic, no shouting, no chaos. That was the strange thing. The aliens had expected chaos. Admiral Ben Carter walked to the podium. He was 62 years old, with white hair cut short and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He had served in 3 conflicts during his career. He had medals that he kept in a box in his closet because looking at them made him feel sick. He had spent the last 10 years praying that he would never have to fight again. Now he stood before the world, knowing that his prayers had not been answered. 3 days ago, we received a message from the Dravok hegemony, he began. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to it that made people lean closer to their screens. They have given us 30 days to surrender our planet. They believe we are weak. They believe we will simply give up. He paused and looked directly into the cameras. They are wrong. A murmur went through the crowd, but Carter raised his hand for silence. We have dreaded this day, he continued. Not because we fear defeat. We dreaded this day because we know what we become when we are forced to fight. Every one of us has heard the stories. Every one of us has seen the photographs. Every one of us knows what our species is capable of when we are pushed to the edge. He took a deep breath. The aliens watched us build memorials and thought we were afraid. They saw us cry for our fallen and thought we were soft. They do not understand that we remember our wars so clearly because we never want to become that version of ourselves again. But if they force our hand, we will show them why we built those memorials in the first place. Across the planet, something began to change. It was not sudden. It was not loud. It was more like a wave moving slowly across an ocean, building strength as it traveled. In Detroit, a factory that built cars received new orders. The workers looked at the plans and recognized what they were being asked to make. Some of them nodded quietly. Others went to the bathrooms and did not come out for a long time, but when they returned, they began to work. In California, a university research lab stopped its work on cancer treatments. The scientists were given new equations to solve. trajectories, velocities, impact calculations. One young researcher asked her supervisor what they were designing. He did not answer, but she saw his hands shaking as he typed. In Texas, recruitment offices that had been quiet for years suddenly had lines stretching around the block. Young men and women stood in those lines, their faces serious. Most of them had grown up hearing their grandparents' stories about wars fought long ago. They had hoped they would never have to write their own stories. But hope, it seemed, was a luxury they could no longer afford. Private Danny Reyes was 22 years old. He had grown up in a small town in New Mexico, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened. He had been planning to go to college, maybe study engineering, maybe meet a nice girl, and settle down. Those plans seemed very far away now. He stood at the door of his mother's house, a small bag over his shoulder. His mother was a short woman with gray hair and tired eyes. She had raised him alone after his father died when Danny was just a boy. She had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. She had done everything she could to give him a good life. Now she was watching him leave for war. "I have something for you," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metal chain. Hanging from it were 2 metal tags, worn smooth by time. "These belong to your great-grandfather," she said. "He carried them in a war fought over 100 years ago. He came home, but he was never the same. He used to wake up screaming in the night. He never talked about what he saw." Danny took the tags and held them in his hand. They were cold and heavy. "He told me once that war was the worst thing a person could experience," his mother continued. "But he also said that, sometimes, there are things worth fighting for. Things worth protecting." She reached up and touched his face. "Come home," she whispered. "Please come home." Danny hugged her tight. He could feel her shaking against him. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay. He wanted to tell her that he would definitely come back, but he had heard too many stories about soldiers who made promises they could not keep. "I'll try," he said. All across Earth, similar scenes were playing out. Parents saying goodbye to children, husbands saying goodbye to wives, friends making promises that they hoped they could keep. The Dravok watched all of this through their monitoring systems. They saw the factories changing their production. They saw the recruitment lines. They saw the tearful goodbyes, and they laughed. "They cry even as they prepare for war," Commander Zethkar said to his officers. "This will be like crushing insects beneath our feet. They will break at the first sign of real combat." His officers agreed. They had fought many species across the galaxy. They had seen civilizations crumble at the sight of the Dravok fleet. These humans would be no different, but there was one thing the Dravok did not understand. Humans did not fight the way other species fought. Other species fought because they were angry. They fought because they hated their enemies. They fought with passion and fury, and when that passion faded, they gave up. Humans were different. Humans fought while crying. They fought while praying for their enemies' souls. They fought with tears streaming down their faces and apologies on their lips. They hated war. They genuinely, truly hated it. But that did not mean they were bad at it. In fact, it meant the opposite. Because humans had learned long ago that the things they hated most were often the things they were best at. And they had spent centuries building systems and institutions and rules designed to keep that terrible talent locked away. The Dravok had just broken those locks. As the 30-day deadline approached, the preparations accelerated. Ships that had been sitting in storage were activated. Weapons that had been hidden were brought out. Plans that had been made and prayed would never be needed were put into action. Admiral Carter stood in a command center deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by screens and officers and the weight of human history. "Are we ready?" he asked. General Maria Santos, his second-in-command, nodded. "As ready as we'll ever be." Carter looked at the screens, showing the approaching Dravok fleet. 300 ships. More firepower than humanity had ever faced, but he was not afraid. He was sad. "God forgive us for what we're about to do," he said quietly. And somewhere in the darkness of space, Humanity's true nature began to stir. The Dravok fleet entered the Sol system on the morning of the 31st day. Commander Zethkar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Crushing Might, and smiled at the sight before him. 300 warships followed behind him, their weapons charged and ready. Each ship was capable of destroying a small moon. Together, they represented the greatest military force the Dravok had ever assembled, and they were about to claim a new world. Any response from the humans? Zethkar asked his communications officer. Nothing, Commander. Complete silence. Zethkar's smile grew wider. They are hiding. They know they cannot win, so they cower in their homes and wait for the end. He turned to his tactical officer. Begin the approach to Earth. Standard conquest formation. The fleet moved forward, passing the outer planets of the system. Jupiter with its giant storms. Saturn with its beautiful rings. The small, cold worlds at the edge of human space. Everything was quiet. Everything was still. Too quiet, perhaps. Too still, but Zethkar was too confident to notice. As the fleet passed the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, something strange appeared on the sensors. Small objects, barely visible, were floating among the rocks. The tactical officer frowned and zoomed in on one of them. It was a metal box, about the size of a small room. There were no markings on it. No lights. No signs of activity. It just floated there, cold and dead. What is that? Zethkar asked. Unknown, Commander. It appears to be some kind of debris, perhaps human trash. Zethkar nodded. Humans were known for leaving their garbage everywhere. Their own planet was proof of that. Ignore it. Continue forward. The fleet continued past the asteroids. They passed Mars, the red planet that humans had dreamed of visiting for centuries. They passed the moon, Earth's pale companion, and finally, they saw their prize. Earth, a blue and green jewel floating in the darkness. Oceans and continents and clouds. Billions of humans living their small, meaningless lives. Soon, those lives would belong to the Dravok. Zethkar opened a channel to broadcast to the entire planet. He wanted them to hear his voice. He wanted them to know their conquerors. People of Earth, he said, his voice booming through every radio frequency. Your 30 days have ended. You have not surrendered. You have not even responded. Your cowardice is noted, but it will not save you. Prepare to. He never finished his sentence. The first warning came from his sensor officer. Commander. Energy signatures. Thousands of them. Zethkar spun around. What? Where? Everywhere, sir. The asteroids, the moon, the dead space between planets. They're all activating. On the tactical display, the system map was changing. Those small metal boxes that Zethkar had dismissed as garbage were coming alive. Lights blinked on. Engines fired. Weapons charged. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, hidden among the rocks and dust of the solar system. Humanity had placed its true defenses. Not ships that could be seen and tracked and destroyed. Not bases that could be targeted and bombed, but small, silent, patient weapons that waited in the darkness for their moment to strike. That moment had come. Admiral Carter's voice crackled across every Dravok frequency, cutting through Zethkar's transmission like a knife. You were warned. The Dravok commander felt something cold run down his spine. The human's voice was not angry. It was not frightened. It was sad. Deeply, genuinely sad. Every child on Earth knows what we are capable of, Carter continued. Every monument you mocked, every memorial you laughed at, every tear we shed. It was not weakness. It was mourning. We were mourning for the enemies we knew we would one day have to face. We were mourning for you. The first wave of kinetic impactors launched. They were simple weapons, really, just rocks, attached to small engines. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, but they were moving at speeds that should have been impossible. Speeds that turned simple stones into weapons more powerful than any bomb. The rocks hit the Dravok fleet like rain hitting a paper boat. Ships that had survived 100 battles crumpled like toys. Shields that had held against the most advanced weapons in the galaxy failed instantly. In the first 7 minutes, 90 Dravok vessels ceased to exist. On the bridge of the crushing might, chaos erupted. Officers screamed, alarms blared. The ship shook as debris from nearby vessels struck its hull. "Return fire," Zethkar screamed. "Target the weapon platforms." His weapons officers tried. They really did. But the human weapons were too small, too spread out, too numerous. For every platform they destroyed, 10 more fired. For every rock they intercepted, 100 more came from different directions. Lieutenant Kate Morrison watched the tactical display from the bridge of the horizon, which had been converted into a command ship. The blue dots representing human weapons were everywhere. The red dots representing Dravok ships were disappearing one by one. "They're breaking formation," she reported to Admiral Carter. "Their fleet is scattering." Carter nodded slowly. His face was pale, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Launch the second wave," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Kate hesitated for just a moment. She looked at the screen, at the Dravok ships trying desperately to retreat. Many of them had stopped firing. Some were broadcasting surrender signals. They had been so confident just minutes ago. Now, they were running. "Sir," she said carefully, "they're retreating. Some of them are surrendering." Carter closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I know," he said, "but we can't let any of them escape. If even one ship returns to the hegemony, they'll know our capabilities. They'll build counters. They'll come back with a larger fleet." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "We have to end this, now, completely." Kate understood. She did not like it, but she understood. "Launching second wave," she said. The second wave was not rocks. The second wave was ships. Human warships that had been hiding in the shadow of Earth's moon. They were smaller than the Dravok vessels, faster, more maneuverable, and they were absolutely merciless. Private Danny Reyes was aboard one of those ships, a Marine assigned to a boarding team. He felt the vessel shake as it accelerated toward the fleeing enemy. Through a small window, he could see the lights of weapons fire, the flashes of explosions, the dark shapes of dying ships. He gripped his great-grandfather's dog tags and said a silent prayer. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted 3 hours. When it was over, not a single Dravok ship remained operational. 287 vessels destroyed. 13 captured. The greatest military defeat in Dravok history, and humanity was just getting started. On Earth, news of the victory spread quickly. People cheered, they celebrated. They hugged each other in the streets, but in the command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, there was no celebration. Admiral Carter sat alone in his office, staring at a screen showing the debris field that had once been a fleet. General Santos found him there an hour later. "The Dravok hegemony is demanding an explanation," she said. "The Galactic Coalition is calling for emergency meetings. Everyone wants to know how we did this." Carter did not look at her. He just kept staring at the screen. "Tell them the truth," he said finally. "Tell them we did exactly what we said we would do. We warned them. They didn't listen." Santos nodded and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Ben," she said quietly, "are you okay?" Carter laughed. It was not a happy laugh. "No," he said. "I'm not. And I won't be for a long time." He finally turned to look at her. "But that's the point, isn't it? That's why we're human. We win. And then we spend the rest of our lives trying to live with what we've done." Santos had no answer to that. She simply nodded and left him alone with his ghosts. The Dravok carrier drifted in the darkness, its engines dead and its weapons silent. It was one of the 13 ships that had survived the initial assault, captured rather than destroyed. Inside its metal walls, 3,000 Dravok waited and wondered what the humans would do to them. They had heard stories about what happened to prisoners of war. In the Dravok hegemony, Captured enemies were usually worked to death in labor camps, or used for entertainment in fighting arenas. They expected the humans to be the same, perhaps worse. Sergeant Lisa Grant led the boarding team through the airlock. She was 30 years old, with short blonde hair and a scar on her left cheek from an accident during training. She had joined the military right out of high school, following in her father's footsteps. He had been a soldier too. He had come home from his wars, but the best parts of him had stayed behind. Lisa had promised herself she would not make the same mistakes. She would stay human. She would stay kind. But as she moved through the dark corridors of the enemy ship, she felt something cold growing in her chest. Something patient and focused. Something that knew exactly what to do and how to do it. Her team moved in perfect formation behind her. Private Danny Reyes was there, his great-grandfather's dog tags tucked beneath his armor. Corporal Amy Chen walked point, her weapon sweeping left and right. Specialist Marcus Cole covered the rear, his eyes never stopping their constant scan. They were young. They were scared. But they had been trained by people who had been trained by people who had been trained by people who had fought in the worst wars humanity had ever known. Generations of knowledge had been passed down, refined, perfected. The first contact came at the third junction. A group of Dravok warriors had set up a barricade, their weapons pointed at the approaching humans. They were desperate. They were terrified. They opened fire the moment the humans came into view. Lisa did not feel fear. She did not feel anger. She felt something else entirely. A cold, clear focus that made everything seem to move in slow motion. Her hand came up. Her weapon fired. 3 shots. 3 Dravok dropped. Her team moved past her, spreading out, covering angles, eliminating threats with mechanical precision. It was over in less than a minute. 7 Dravok lay on the ground. 2 were dead. 5 were injured. Lisa's team had not lost a single member. They had not even been slowed down. She stared at the fallen aliens and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just a strange emptiness where her emotions should have been. "Secure the wounded," she ordered. "Get them medical attention." Her team obeyed without question. They moved through the ship, room by room, level by level. Every time they met resistance, the result was the same. The Dravok were larger. The Dravok were stronger. The Dravok had better weapons. But the humans were faster, smarter, more coordinated. They moved like they could read each other's minds. They anticipated every trap. They countered every ambush. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was simply the result of centuries of practice. Humanity had been fighting itself for so long that war had become second nature. Every lesson learned in every conflict had been preserved, studied, improved upon. The Dravok had conquered dozens of species, but they had never faced anything like this. The bridge of the carrier was the final objective. Captain Vornak, the ship's commander, waited there with his remaining officers. He knew he was going to die. He had accepted that. But he would die fighting, as a Dravok warrior should. When the humans breached the door, he raised his weapon and charged. Lisa sidestepped his attack with almost casual ease. Her hand shot out, striking a nerve cluster in his neck. He crumpled to the ground, paralyzed but alive. Around him, his officers fell the same way. Precise strikes, non-lethal takedowns, not a single killing blow. The battle for the bridge lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, Lisa stood in the center of the room, surrounded by groaning Dravok. Her hands were steady, her breathing was calm. She had done everything perfectly. Textbook technique. Minimum casualties. And that was when the horror finally hit her. It had been so easy. She had just disabled a dozen alien warriors. Beings who had conquered planets and enslaved millions. She had done it without breaking a sweat. Without missing a beat. Without feeling anything at all. What kind of monster was she? She gave orders to her team. Secure the prisoners. Call for medical assistance. Begin cataloging the ship. They obeyed without question. They trusted her. They looked up to her. They did not see her hands starting to shake. Private Danny Reyes found her an hour later, sitting alone in a storage room. She was staring at her hands as if she had never seen them before. Her weapon lay on the floor beside her, abandoned. "Sarge?" he said quietly. "You okay?" Lisa looked up at him. In her eyes, he saw something he recognized. Something he had seen in his great-grandfather's eyes in old photographs. Something broken and hurting. "I did everything right," she said. Her voice was hollow. "Clean shots, minimal casualties. Just like training, just like the simulations." She turned her hands over, examining them like they belonged to someone else. "That's the worst part. Danny, it's easy. It's so easy for us." Danny sat down beside her. He did not know what to say. He was just a kid from New Mexico. What did he know about the weight of killing? But he knew what his mother had told him before he left. He knew the stories his family had passed down. He knew that his great-grandfather had felt the same way. 100 years ago, in a war fought with different weapons but the same terrible human efficiency. "My grandmother used to tell me something," he said slowly. "She said that the good soldiers are the ones who hate it. The ones who feel sick after. The ones who can't sleep at night. Oh, Nikan to her force side. Receivin with 2B. The Receivin concepts of skade. The ones who can't sleep at night." Lisa laughed bitterly. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Danny admitted. "I guess not. But it means you're still human. You're not a monster. A monster wouldn't care. A monster would enjoy this." Lisa looked at him for a long moment. Then she took a shaky breath and nodded slowly. "The prisoners need medical attention," she said. "The ones we captured. We need to make sure they're treated properly." "Already being done," Danny said. "Amy's got the medics working on them." Lisa nodded again. She picked up her weapon and stood. The shaking in her hands had stopped, but it would come back later. Danny knew it would. It always did. Back on Earth, the news channels showed celebrations. Parades in the streets. Flags waving. People singing and dancing. Victory. The word was everywhere. But in the veteran halls, in the quiet bars where old soldiers gathered, there were no celebrations. Men and women who had served in forgotten wars sat in silence, drinking slowly, staring at nothing. They knew what the young soldiers would face when they came home. They knew the nightmares that waited. The flashbacks. The guilt. The terrible knowledge that you were good at something awful. A message was sent to the Galactic Coalition. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was something closer to a plea. "We did not want this. We warned you. We begged you. Leave us in peace. Or share their fate." The message traveled across the stars, reaching species who had never heard of Earth before. They looked at the recordings of the battle. They saw the human weapons platforms activating in the darkness. They saw the Dravok fleet crumbling like paper. And for the first time in galactic history, ancient empires that had conquered thousands of worlds felt something they had not felt in millennia. Fear. Not fear of defeat. Not fear of death. Fear of what humanity might become if pushed any further. Sergeant Lisa Grant returned to Earth 3 months later. She received a medal for her service. She smiled for the cameras. She shook hands with politicians. And every night, she lay awake in the darkness, staring at hands that had done terrible things with terrible ease. Hands that belonged to a soldier. Hands that belonged to a monster. Hands that belonged to a human. 6 months had passed since the battle in the Sol system. 6 months of silence from Earth. 6 months of fear spreading through the galaxy like a slow poison. The Dravok hegemony had collapsed, not from human attacks, but from within. The species they had enslaved for generations had seen the recordings of the battle. They had watched the mighty Dravok fleet crumble in minutes. And they had realized something that changed everything. The masters could be beaten. Rebellions erupted across Dravok space. Slave colonies rose up against their oppressors. Factory worlds stopped producing. Mining operations shut down. The empire that had taken centuries to build fell apart in weeks. And everywhere the rebellions spread, rumors spread with them. Rumors of human tactics, human strategies, human advisors who appeared in the darkest hour to teach the oppressed how to fight. No one could prove it, of course. The humans claimed they had nothing to do with it. They said they were simply minding their own business on their little blue planet. But the timing was suspicious. The methods were familiar, and the results spoke for themselves. The Galactic Coalition called an emergency session to discuss what they had begun calling the human question. Thousands of species gathered in the Great Hall once again, but the mood was very different from the last time. There was no confidence now, no casual dismissal of the strange new species from the edge of the galaxy. There was only uncertainty and fear. Ambassador Vethril of the Corvani was asked to explain his miscalculation. He had been the one who first studied humanity. He had been the one who concluded they were weak. He had been wrong, so terribly, terribly wrong. He rose slowly from his seat, his silver scales dull with stress and sleepless nights. He had spent the past 6 months studying everything he could find about humanity. Their history, their literature, their art, their nightmares. What he had found had kept him awake for weeks. 6 months ago, he began, I stood before this council and told you that humanity was a fearful species. I showed you their memorials, their monuments, their tears. I concluded that they dreaded war because they were weak. He pressed a button on his device. Images appeared in the air above him. But they were not the same images as before. These images were older, darker, harder to look at, trenches stretching for miles, filled with mud and blood and bodies, cities reduced to rubble by weapons that split atoms, camps where humans had systematically murdered millions of their own kind, photographs of soldiers with empty eyes, their souls hollowed out by the things they had seen and done. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked away. Others could not stop staring. This is their history, Vethril said quietly. Not the history they share with outsiders. The history they keep locked away. The history they force their children to learn so that it might never be repeated. He showed more images. Walls covered with names. So many names that they seemed to go on forever. Eternal flames burning in empty squares. Days marked on calendars as times of remembrance, when entire nations stopped to remember the dead. We thought these were signs of weakness, Vethril continued. We thought they built memorials because they feared defeat. We were wrong. So completely wrong. He turned to face the council directly. They do not fear war because they might lose. They fear war because they know they will win. And they know what winning costs. The great hall was silent. Vethril continued, his voice heavy with something that might have been respect, or might have been terror. When humans go to war, they do not fight like other species. They do not rage. They do not lose control. Instead, they become cold, focused, efficient. They calculate the most effective ways to destroy their enemies, and then they execute those calculations with mechanical precision. He paused, choosing his next words carefully, and the entire time, they weep. They pray. They apologize to the gods they believe in, and the ghosts they leave behind. They hate what they are doing. They genuinely, truly hate it, but that does not stop them from doing it. Images changed again. This time, they showed human soldiers returning from the Dravok War. The parades, the celebrations, the flags, and the cheering crowds. But Vethril zoomed in on the faces of the soldiers themselves. They were not celebrating. They were not smiling. They looked like people who had just witnessed the end of the world. Like people who had become something they never wanted to be. After every war, they break, Vethril said. Their soldiers suffer nightmares, flashbacks, guilt that eats at them for the rest of their lives. They build more memorials. They write more books. They make more promises to never let it happen again. He turned off the images. Every institution on Earth, every ceremony, every lesson taught to their children, it is not weakness. It is a cage. A cage they built around their own nature. They know what they are. They know what they become when pushed, and it terrifies them more than any enemy ever could. He sat down heavily, suddenly looking very old and very tired. They are not a fearful species, he said. They are a species that has earned the right to fear, because they have seen themselves at their worst. They have tasted what they are capable of, and they have spent centuries trying to lock that monster away. He looked around at the gathered representatives. We opened the cage, we released the monster, and now we must live with the consequences. The council voted unanimously. Humanity was to be left alone, not as a protected species, not as a quarantined threat, but as something else entirely. A warning written in blood and fire. A lesson for any species foolish enough to test them. The great hall emptied slowly. Representatives returned to their ships, their planets, their governments. They carried with them a new understanding, a new respect, and a new fear. On Earth, Admiral Ben Carter visited the construction site of a new memorial. It was being built in Washington, in a park near other monuments to other wars. The stone was white marble, cool and smooth to the touch. Names were being carved into its surface, one by one. The names of those who had died fighting the Dravok. There were not many. Humanity's losses had been light. A few dozen killed in the boarding operations. A handful lost to accidents and malfunctions. Compared to the Dravok casualties, it was nothing. But to Carter, each name was a universe. A life that would never continue. Dreams that would never be realized. Children who would never be born. He stood before the unfinished memorial, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes following the stone carvers as they worked. A young reporter approached him. She was from one of the big news networks, with a camera operator following behind her. She had a list of questions prepared. Questions about tactics, questions about strategy, questions about what it felt like to command such a complete victory. "Admiral Carter," she said, holding out her microphone. "The Galactic Coalition has officially declared peace with Earth. The Dravok hegemony has collapsed. Our species has proven itself to the galaxy. Do you feel victorious?" Carter did not look at her. He just kept watching the names being carved. "No," he said quietly. "I feel exactly what I should feel." The reporter frowned. "What do you mean?" Carter finally turned to face her. His eyes were tired, haunted. The eyes of a man who had seen too much and remembered all of it. "Victory is just another word for survival," he said. "And survival, for humans, always comes with ghosts." He turned and walked away, leaving the reporter confused and her questions unanswered. But those who had served understood. Sergeant Lisa Grant understood. She stood in the crowd, watching Carter walk away, her own ghosts standing beside her. Private Danny Reyes understood. He held his great-grandfather's dog tags in his hand, feeling the weight of generations of warriors who had carried the same burden. General Maria Santos understood. She had given the orders. She had watched the Dravok fleet die. She would carry those images with her forever. They all understood. Humanity had won. Humanity had proven itself to the galaxy. Humanity had earned respect and fear in equal measure. But the cost was the same as it had always been, the same as it would always be. Because humans did not dread war because they were weak, they dreaded war because they knew the truth. They knew that winning changed you, broke you, made you into something you never wanted to be. And they knew that the ghosts of the people you killed would walk with you forever, whispering in the darkness, reminding you of who you had become. The memorial was finished 3 months later. The names gleamed white in the sunlight. An eternal flame burned at its base. People came from all over the world to pay their respects. And somewhere in the galaxy, species that had never heard of Earth looked at the stars and wondered about the strange little species that cried when it fought, wondered about the monsters that built cages for themselves, wondered if they would ever be foolish enough to open that cage again. The answer, of course, was no. Some lessons only need to be learned once.